That morning, I walked into the courtroom carrying a folder far thinner than my parents' arrogance. They thought today would officially erase me from our family legacy. They had no idea the woman they labeled their useless daughter spent 6 months quietly tracking every bill, signature, and penny the dead could no longer defend. They certainly never expected that by the end of the hearing, the judge would be the one to leave the room in dead silence. My name is Paisley Hughes, and I am 34 years old. The heavy oak doors of the Bellmere County Courthouse felt slick and damp beneath my palms as I pushed them open on that relentlessly rain-soaked morning in November. The weather outside was bleak and unforgiving, a fitting backdrop for the business of tearing a family apart piece by piece. The air inside the old building smelled of wet wool, damp floorboards, and the sour, distinct scent of nervous sweat that clung to the wooden benches. It was the smell of a place where desperate people came to argue about money, morality, and the fractured things left behind by the dead. I wore a dark gray coat, chosen specifically because it was a garment that demanded absolutely no attention and offered no apologies. It was a piece of muted armor woven from unremarkable threads, meant to shield me from the scrutinizing gazes I knew were waiting inside. Under my left arm, pressed tightly against my ribs, I carried a single thick document folder. It was not a chaotic mess of loose papers or haphazard handwritten notes. It was a precisely organized, lethal system. Every single tab was color-coded. Every page was numbered sequentially. Every receipt, every ledger entry, and every medical record was meticulously indexed and cross-referenced. I walked slowly down the central aisle of the courtroom, my sensible heels making a dull, steady, rhythmic sound against the ancient wood floor. I kept my gaze fixed forward. I did not look at the gallery, though I could feel the collective, heavy weight of nearly 100 pairs of eyes pressing sharply into my back. This was Bellmere. In a small town like this, a vicious family inheritance dispute was infinitely better entertainment than anything broadcast on a television screen. The wooden pews behind me were packed tight with nosy neighbors, former high school teachers, local business owners, and wealthy members of the suburban country club my parents frequented every Sunday. I knew exactly what they were whispering to one another behind their manicured hands. I knew the tragic, compelling story they had been eagerly fed over the past 6 weeks. At the plaintiff table, situated on the right side of the room, sat the two architects of that very story, Douglas and Marianne Hughes, my parents. They sat incredibly close together, their shoulders almost touching, projecting a masterclass united front of quiet, dignified suffering. My mother wore a conservative, high-necked navy dress, her posture rigid and perfect, a delicate lace handkerchief clutched tightly in her pale hand like a theatrical prop waiting for its designated cue. My father sat with his hands folded neatly on the polished wood of the table, wearing a tailored suit that looked expensive but suitably subdued, perfectly chosen for a man mourning a terrible loss he only pretended to feel in his heart. Beside them sat their chosen legal counsel, Trent Bell. He was a man whose entire lucrative career was built on the kind of aggressive arrogance that often masqueraded as folksy charm. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost more than a full month of my rent, and his heavy silver watch caught the harsh fluorescent light every time he confidently adjusted his stiff cuffs. Trent possessed the easy, relaxed confidence of a lawyer who was accustomed to winning his cases long before he ever opened his mouth to speak. He relied entirely on forceful first impressions and the loud, persistent projection of his client's supposed victimhood. As I walked past their table, he leaned toward my mother, whispering something low that made her nod with tragic, slow dignity. We were all gathered here today to fight over the last remaining pieces of a woman my parents had spent their entire adult lives quietly dismissing. The case officially listed on the court docket was the dispute over the estate of Corinne Vale. She was my maternal aunt, my mother's older sister, and she had taken her final, laboring breath exactly 6 weeks ago. She died leaving a massive, echoing void in my chest that ached with every beat of my heart. But to the rest of the room, her death was simply a lucrative transaction. She had died, leaving me the sole ownership and full management rights of an aging commercial property located right in the middle of Archer Square. The Archer Square building was by no means a glamorous or modern piece of real estate. It was a solid, three-story structure of faded red brick, heavily weathered by decades of brutal northern winters. It housed a traditional barber shop, a small independent bookstore that always smelled of vanilla and dust, and a quiet notary office on the ground floor. The upper floors held dusty storage spaces and Corinne's own modest, sunlit apartment. To the wealthy developers eyeing the town square, it was an ugly eyesore, but it was not just a building. It was her entire life's work, carefully maintained and fiercely protected against a changing, greedy world. And in the final, quiet months of her life, she had signed a legally binding codicil, ensuring it would become entirely mine. My parents had formally filed a petition to completely invalidate that final codicil. Their official court documents claimed that Corinne had been heavily manipulated, that her mind had rapidly slipped into dementia in her final days, and that she entirely lacked the necessary mental capacity to understand what she was signing away. But their real argument, the poisonous one they had effectively seeded throughout the gossip networks of Bellmere, was much simpler and much uglier to defend against. They claimed I was the classic prodigal daughter who had selfishly abandoned her loving family, cut off all contact for years out of spite, and only swooped back into town because I caught the strong, irresistible scent of an easy inheritance. The low murmurs in the packed gallery swelled slightly as the heavy wooden door directly behind the elevated bench swung open. The armed bailiff called the room to order with a booming voice, and everyone rose to their feet. Judge Miriam Kessler walked in and took her seat. She was a formidable woman in her late 60s, with iron gray hair pulled back into a severe, uncompromising knot at the nape of her neck, and sharp, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had a terrifying reputation in this judicial district, one that routinely made slick lawyers like Trent Bell sweat nervously under their expensive collars. Judge Kessler actively despised cheap theatrics. She possessed a lethal, well-documented intolerance for people who tried to manipulate her courtroom with fake tears and emotional displays, and she despised even more the sheer arrogance of those who thought she was too old or too foolish to see right through their well-rehearsed performances. She adjusted her reading glasses on the bridge of her nose, looked down at the thick docket in front of her, and then let her cold gaze sweep slowly across the entire room. When her eyes landed on the plaintiff table, she paused for a bare fraction of a second, silently taking in the picturesque, perfectly staged display of the grieving brother-in-law and devastated sister. Then she shifted her gaze and looked directly at me, sitting entirely alone at the defense table. From the very first minute I stepped past the swinging wooden gate, the atmosphere in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. I could feel the invisible jaws of the trap they had spent 6 long weeks carefully setting. The false narrative was so thick in the air I could almost taste it. In this room, I was the undeniable villain of this piece. I was the cold, calculating, estranged daughter who had preyed on a weak, dying old woman. My parents had spent their entire adult lives meticulously curating their flawless public image, ensuring that they were always seen as the long-suffering victims of my supposed endless shortcomings. They had painted me as ungrateful, distant, lazy, and fundamentally greedy. They fully expected me to walk into this courtroom today and completely crumble under the crushing weight of their severe accusations and the town's collective, heavy judgment. They expected me to look frantic and defensive, to act erratic, to desperately try to explain myself, and ultimately prove their point by losing my composure in front of the judge. Trent Bell casually glanced over his tailored shoulder at me, a tiny, deeply condescending smile playing on the edges of his lips. My mother dramatically dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with her lace handkerchief, sighing loudly enough for the front row of the gallery to hear. They were waiting for me to panic. They were waiting for the useless daughter to break, but I did not panic. I felt a cold, sharp, terrifying calm settle over my skin. It was the specific kind of calm that comes not from an ignorance of the present danger, but from a place of absolute, exhaustive preparation. I reached out and unbuttoned my dark gray coat, sliding it smoothly off my shoulders and draping it neatly, deliberately over the back of my heavy wooden chair. I sat down, feeling the solid wood beneath me, grounding me in the reality of the room. I brought my color-coded folder to the exact center of the dark mahogany table. I opened the thick cover, revealing the pristine, perfectly aligned stacks of paper hidden within: bank statements, tax records, maintenance logs, medical timelines, hundreds of pages. Every single lie they had confidently told, every financial discrepancy they arrogantly thought no one would ever bother to notice, was cleanly mapped out right in front of me. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a simple, inexpensive black pen. I placed the pen gently on the table, aligning it perfectly parallel to the bottom edge of the open folder. I adjusted the thick stack of documents so they sat exactly squarely in front of me, making sure every corner was perfectly flush. I did not look across the aisle at my parents. I did not look at their smug, overpriced lawyer. I did not look back at the gallery full of people who firmly thought they knew the truth of my story. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the undeniable evidence of my aunt's life and the documented proof of my family's relentless greed. I sat there in the heavy silence, breathing slowly, feeling the immense pressure continue to build in the breathless room. I did not look like a frightened daughter who had come back home to beg for forgiveness or understanding. Nor did I look like a desperate thief trying to poorly justify a stolen prize. I looked exactly like what I was trained to be: a cold, meticulous professional who had come to complete a final, devastating audit. I grew up in a house where love was not a given baseline, but a heavily conditional, tightly controlled currency. In our fiercely polished home, every single action, every minor choice, and every spoken word was rigorously evaluated against a single, unyielding metric. The only question that truly mattered was whether or not it made the family look good to the outside world. There were absolutely no physical bruises on my skin, no shattered porcelain plates thrown in anger against the pristine kitchen wall, and no dramatic, screaming matches that ever threatened to bring the local police to our manicured front lawn. My parents were far too civilized, far too concerned with their standing in the community, for that kind of loud, overt cruelty. Their specific method of breaking a person down was much quieter, much more refined, and infinitely more eroding. They whittled away at my core sense of self with a constant, freezing drizzle of casual, sophisticated disdain. I was never a rebellious or difficult child. I did not sneak out of second-story windows at midnight. I did not fall into bad, dangerous crowds. And I never once brought a single ounce of public scandal to their pristine doorstep. I maintained a steady, consistently high grade point average, secured a quiet part-time job shelving books at the local town library the exact moment I turned 16 years old, and deliberately made myself as small, compliant, and low maintenance as humanly possible. But in their eyes, my quiet, steady stability was never considered a valuable asset. It was always viewed as a glaring, embarrassing deficit. To them, my lack of noise was an unforgivable lack of ambition. My refusal to dominate a room was a personal failure that reflected poorly on their parenting. My father viewed my meticulous, careful nature with a thinly veiled, naked contempt. He was a man who thrived exclusively on grand, sweeping gestures, loud, booming handshakes, and the kind of forceful, aggressive charisma that dominated local country club meetings. Whenever I spent a solid 3 hours organizing the chaotic, overflowing family filing cabinet into a perfectly alphabetized system, or carefully balancing my own meager teenage checkbook to the exact, precise penny, he would walk past my small bedroom and shake his head in profound disappointment. He openly called my focused efforts incredibly petty and entirely trivial. He told me, usually over a heavy crystal glass of expensive evening scotch, that people who focused on the small, unseen details were permanently destined to spend their entire lives working as invisible drones for the superior people who actually had the vision to look at the big, important picture. My mother, on the other hand, weaponized her constant disappointment with a soft, deeply pitying tone that was somehow far worse than any outright, screaming anger. She was a woman who navigated our affluent suburban society like a highly trained, seasoned diplomat, constantly collecting influential friends and lucrative social connections with a terrifying, calculated efficiency. She would frequently sigh, adjusting her perfect pearls, and loudly tell her wealthy tennis partners that I simply lacked the necessary bounce required to succeed in life. She told anyone who would listen that I had absolutely no idea how to properly network or charm a crowded room, loudly lamenting that I was simply, fundamentally incapable of ever doing big things. It quickly became a rigid, suffocating, and completely inescapable pattern. Whenever I achieved something objectively impressive or academically difficult, it was immediately and ruthlessly downgraded. It was either dismissed as a stroke of pure, unadulterated luck, or it was confidently attributed to the suddenly lowered academic standards of the institution granting the award. When I won a highly competitive regional analytical essay contest out of over 2,000 desperate applicants, my mother simply smiled a tight, entirely bloodless smile and told our dinner guests that the judges must have been looking for something quaint and ordinary that specific year. Conversely, every minor, entirely normal human misstep I made was violently and disproportionately magnified. Every tiny flaw was instantly transformed into undeniable, solid proof of my inherent genetic inadequacy. If I failed to secure the absolute top percentile score on a difficult standardized test, or if I did not get formally invited to the most exclusive, highly coveted social event of the autumn season, my father would deliver a long, solemn, painfully condescending lecture. He would sit me down in his dark wood study and meticulously explain how I fundamentally lacked the right, aggressive stuff needed to survive and thrive in a highly competitive, modern world. I was a quiet ghost haunting my own childhood home, a perpetual, breathing disappointment simply for existing as a solitary person they could not aggressively boast about at their lavish weekend dinner parties. The ultimate, absolute breaking point finally arrived with the silent, devastating evaporation of my entire future. For 4 long, exhausting years of undergraduate study, I had worked 2 physically demanding jobs, ruthlessly funneling every single spare dollar I earned into a joint savings account my parents had generously, insistently offered to manage for my future graduate school tuition. I had mathematically calculated the exact, precise amount I needed to survive and pay for my advanced degree. I had willingly sacrificed holidays, weekend trips, and basic daily comforts to painstakingly reach a sum of exactly $42,000. That money was my planned escape velocity. It was the solid, concrete financial foundation of the completely independent life I so desperately, hungrily craved. Then came the Tuesday morning I finally received my official acceptance letter to a rigorous, highly respected analytical program located 3 states away. I immediately drove to the local bank branch to formally transfer the hard-earned funds into my own, private account, only to find an available account balance of barely $53. A cold, absolute, and terrifying panic seized my throat, making it physically difficult to draw breath. When I drove back to the house and confronted them in the pristine, perfectly vacuumed, sunlit living room, there was absolutely no apology waiting for me. There was not even a fleeting microscopic flicker of human shame in either of their eyes. My father stood by the fireplace and casually, smoothly explained that they had desperately needed to withdraw those specific funds to immediately cover a massive, completely reckless margin call on a disastrous, highly leveraged commercial real estate investment he had arrogantly made without consulting a single financial advisor. He waved his hand dismissively through the air, acting exactly as if my 4 brutal years of minimum wage labor were nothing more than a minor, temporary inconvenience to his grand plans. My mother did not comfort me. Instead, she told me to immediately lower my voice and act my chronological age. She looked me dead in the eye, her posture perfect and unyielding, and demanded that I instantly sympathize with their incredibly difficult, stressful financial situation. She coldly insisted that true family members must always, without question, be willing to make sudden, painful sacrifices for the greater, overall good of the entire household. That was the exact, crystalline moment the final, fragile, fraying thread, holding me to them completely snapped. The subsequent, final argument did not actually explode over the stolen money itself. The money was already gone, permanently vanished into the bottomless black hole of my father's misplaced, unearned ego. The fight was entirely, exclusively about their breathtakingly arrogant, utterly entitled attitude. As I stood there in the center of the room, looking closely at their profoundly untroubled, deeply self-righteous faces, a horrifying, liberating realization finally crystallized in my mind. I suddenly realized that to them, my only tangible, measurable value was my ability to remain perfectly silent and willingly absorb the heavy consequences of their massive failures while pretending those failures were actually noble virtues. I was fully expected to be a convenient, quiet sponge for their countless mistakes and a silent, uncomplaining prop for their desperately fragile self-image. I did not yell. I did not shed a single, solitary tear. I simply turned around on my heel and walked silently up the carpeted stairs to my bedroom. I methodically packed 2 heavy canvas suitcases with only the clothes I absolutely needed. I left the town of Bellmere exactly 4 hours before the sun even thought about rising over the distant eastern town limits. I did not leave a dramatic, tear-stained note on the kitchen counter. I drove my old, beaten-up sedan for 6 straight, exhausting hours, rented a tiny, cramped, deeply unremarkable apartment in a sprawling, entirely anonymous northern city, and immediately changed my personal cellular phone number. I spent the next several years methodically, deliberately constructing a brand new, meticulously organized existence. I built a solitary, highly focused, incredibly quiet life, where absolutely no one in my immediate biological family was ever again granted the supreme privilege of interpreting my private actions or dictating my personal worth to the world. In the incredibly deafening heavy silence of my permanent, self-imposed exile, there was only one single person who absolutely refused to twist my sudden, unannounced absence into a malicious, unforgivable sin. That person was Corinne Vale. She lived entirely alone in her modest, dust-filled apartment located directly above the quiet businesses operating in the old Archer building, constantly surrounded by towering, precarious stacks of old, leather-bound books and the steady, comforting hum of the commercial street located directly below her living room window. She did not aggressively bombard my new phone with hysterical, guilt-tripping voicemails, and she never once demanded that I explain myself to the very people who had coldly, casually robbed me of my future. Instead, she deeply respected the hard, unforgiving boundary I had suddenly drawn with the sheer, raw desperation of a badly cornered animal. Every few weeks, completely unprompted, my phone would ring on a quiet Sunday afternoon, and her raspy, deeply grounded voice would come clearly through the small speaker. She never once asked if I was finally going to apologize to my parents. She never once asked when I was planning on coming back home to fulfill my supposed, imaginary familial duties. She only ever asked me one single, profoundly simple, incredibly heavy question: are you living true to yourself? Corinne was a woman carved entirely from the heavy, pragmatic bedrock of northern practicality. She was a person who found profound, almost physical offense in the concept of wasted breath or frivolous conversation. She never once offered me grand, sweeping declarations of familial loyalty, nor did she ever mount loud, performative defenses on my behalf during the suffocating, chaotic holiday dinners of my youth. Her specific brand of love was a completely different species. It was structural. It was quietly load-bearing. She treated me, simply and consistently, as a deeply capable, entirely trustworthy human being. While my childhood home constantly demanded an impossible, exhausting standard of polished perfection, Corinne only ever asked for clear-eyed honesty. The Archer building was her absolute domain. To the aggressive, wealthy commercial developers who were constantly circling the perimeter of Bellmere like impatient vultures, the property was just an aging, highly inefficient block of late 19th century red brick sitting heavily on incredibly valuable downtown real estate. To the rest of the town, it was a familiar, fading background element of their daily commute. But to my aunt, It was the undeniable, physical proof of her entire existence. And to me, it was the singular, quiet sanctuary where I was actually allowed to finish a complete, complex thought without being swiftly corrected, ruthlessly managed, or loudly spoken over. I vividly remember sitting on her worn, olive green velvet sofa when I was a teenager, listening to the muffled, rhythmic thrum of the town outside, smelling the faint, comforting mixture of binding glue from the bookstore below and the sharp medicinal scent of barbicide from the ground floor barber shop. It was the only place in the world where my shoulders ever finally dropped away from my ears. When I eventually packed my life into 2 suitcases and moved away, the vast physical distance between us did not sever that quiet, crucial bond. Instead, our relationship naturally evolved into a steady, unspoken partnership built entirely on digital spreadsheets, scanned invoices, and long evening phone calls. Corinne was brilliant at managing difficult tenants and negotiating with stubborn local contractors, but she was deeply, fiercely suspicious of modern accounting software. Over the course of 7 long years, I willingly became her invisible, remote ledger keeper. From my cramped, poorly lit kitchen table, hundreds of miles away, I spent almost every single Sunday evening meticulously digitizing over 4 decades of her complex, handwritten rental records. I carefully reviewed the lengthy, incredibly dense maintenance contracts for the ancient, temperamental basement boiler system, painstakingly translating the deliberate legal jargon into plain, actionable language she could actually use to negotiate better terms. I set up automated, remote calendar reminders for her massive quarterly property tax payments and the mandatory biannual commercial roof inspections. We would spend exactly 45 minutes on the phone every other week. We did not gossip about the neighbors. We did not discuss my parents. We discussed the frustrating 12% annual increase in commercial liability insurance premiums, the persistent plumbing issues severely affecting the ground floor washrooms, and the slight, highly calculated annual adjustments to the commercial storefront leases. It was precisely in these dry, deeply numerical conversations that I felt truly, profoundly valued. I was not a disappointment to her. I was a trusted colleague guarding her fortress. The shift in her normally steady tone did not happen suddenly. It arrived much like a slow-moving, freezing weather front, a gradual, creeping accumulation of subtle, chilling pressure. It started somewhere right around her 78th birthday. During our routine evening calls, her usually crisp, direct updates about the state of the building began to carry a heavy, trailing edge of deep, uncharacteristic suspicion. She casually mentioned that my father had suddenly taken to dropping by unannounced on Tuesday afternoons, bringing aggressively cheerful attitudes and expensive bakery pastries she told him she could not eat. She noted that my mother was suddenly intensely curious about the structural integrity of the external brick facade and the remaining lifespan of the roof. But the true, blaring alarm bells always rang whenever Corinne purposely steered our conversation toward the building's substantial, well-funded capital reserve accounts. Those were the crucial, closely guarded funds she had painstakingly built over 40 long years, specifically designed to protect the historic property from sudden, catastrophic disasters. Whenever she merely mentioned the existence of that specific money, she noted, the entire atmosphere in the room would completely change. The casual, supposedly friendly family visits felt less like familial duty and far more like quiet, predatory reconnaissance. Then came the first physical warning. It arrived on a heavily raining Wednesday, entirely unprompted, shipped via priority overnight service. Inside the small padded mailer, wrapped simply in a piece of plain white printer paper, was a heavy brass spare key to the reinforced solid wood door of her private home office. Exactly 3 weeks later, a second, much heavier package arrived at my apartment. This one contained a thick, securely sealed manila envelope. Across the front, written in her sharp, unmistakable, angular handwriting, was a single, chilling directive. Open only if they start rushing. I held that thick envelope in my hands for a very long time, standing perfectly still in my small kitchen, feeling the undeniable physical weight of the paper and the immense, invisible burden of what it undoubtedly represented. I called her that exact same evening, my voice tight and thin with a rapidly rising, fiercely protective panic. I practically begged her to just speak clearly and directly to her longtime estate attorney, to vocalize her growing, very real fears to someone with an official legal badge or a state mandate. Corinna's response was a masterclass in the cold, brutal, deeply unfair reality of aging in America. She let out a short, dry, utterly humorless breath over the receiver that sounded exactly like dead leaves scraping across dry concrete. She told me, her voice dropping into a low, completely steady, and terrifyingly clear register, that society has a very specific, incredibly convenient way of listening to the elderly. She explained that when old people speak fondly of the distant past, or offer gentle, harmless, folksy advice, everyone smiles warmly, nods their heads, and calls them wise. But the exact moment an old person speaks an inconvenient truth, she warned me, especially a truth that stands directly between ambitious, greedy relatives and a very substantial pile of liquid money, the public narrative instantly, violently shifts. Suddenly, they are no longer considered wise. They are labeled confused. They are called paranoid. They are looked at with deep, fake pity and described as unfortunately slipping away. She knew exactly what would happen if she started loudly accusing her perfectly respectable, highly socially prominent sister and brother-in-law of quiet financial circling. She would be instantly dismissed, forcibly medically evaluated, and swiftly managed into absolute permanent silence. As I sat alone in my dark apartment that night, staring blankly at the sealed manila envelope resting ominously on my dining table, the complete, devastating reality of my permanent position finally locked firmly into place. Corinne was not just passively leaving me a piece of commercial real estate. She was deliberately passing me a heavy iron shield and a sharpened sword. She knew the exact predatory nature of the people we were dealing with. She knew their vast capacity for aggressive, incredibly polite theft. She had clearly recognized the cold, hard, unyielding competence in me, the very same trait my parents had so thoroughly despised and tried to crush, and she had proactively chosen to weaponize it for her own posthumous protection. I realized then that if the dark day ever finally came when the absolute worst happened, my assigned role would not be the simple, passive, expected role of a weeping, grieving heir. I would have to be the sole designated survivor of her entire legacy. I would have to be the one single person standing in the center of the room, utterly clear-headed, entirely unsentimental, and thoroughly equipped to carve a brutally sharp, undeniable line between a family genuinely in mourning and a family completely consumed by absolute, ravenous greed. I did not open the envelope. I placed it carefully inside my heavy fireproof steel lockbox, closed the lid, and simply went back to my computer to run another flawless audit. I secured a position at the Interstate Contract Integrity Bureau. It was a massive, profoundly quiet government contractor building where the carpets were a deliberate, stain-resistant gray, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a low, constant frequency. I began my career there at the absolute bottom of the organizational chart. My initial title was Junior Records Checker, a role that paid just above minimum wage. My daily existence consisted of sitting in a tiny cubicle, staring at dual monitors for 8 solid hours a day, and matching basic shipping manifests to state funding requests. It was tedious, eye-straining labor, but I thrived in the absolute silence of the data. Within 4 years, I earned 3 consecutive promotions, eventually securing the highly demanding title of Senior Document Analyst. My work was entirely devoid of social glamour. There were no expensive client dinners, no public accolades, and no networking events. But sitting in that quiet, climate-controlled environment, I forged my natural inclination for meticulous detail into a highly dangerous professional weapon. I was rigorously trained to hunt liars. I developed the ability to identify the microscopic, unnatural heartbeat of a fraudulent financial transaction. I learned that an invoice that matched a purchase order too perfectly right down to the final zero, was almost always a manufactured lie. I learned to spot the slight, hesitant variations in a forged signature, and I learned how to track a phantom vendor routing illicit funds through 3 different shell companies just to buy a non-existent shipment of commercial construction supplies. I spent my days dissecting deception, tearing apart false narratives, until only the indisputable numbers remained. I never shared a single detail of this rigorous career trajectory with my mother or my father. I knew from decades of bitter, exhausting experience that any solid piece of personal information I handed them would immediately be thrown into their twisted public relations machine. If I told them I was a senior analyst handling complex fraud investigations, my father would undoubtedly mock the bureaucratic, government nature of the title to my face. Conversely, my mother would wildly exaggerate my authority to her wealthy country club friends, claiming I was some sort of high-powered executive just to artificially inflate her own social standing. So, I offered them absolutely nothing. I actively starved them of my reality. In the total absence of actual facts, they simply constructed a brand new, highly convenient fictional narrative about my life. While I was quietly building a solid, financially secure career and saving tens of thousands of dollars, they were actively whispering over crystal wine glasses at their weekly dinner parties that I was deeply, tragically struggling. They told their influential acquaintances that I was bouncing between meaningless, unstable odd jobs, living in quiet squalor in a dangerous neighborhood, and that my foolish, stubborn pride was the only thing preventing me from crawling back to Bellmere to beg for their financial mercy. They painted themselves as heartbroken, endlessly patient figures, waiting for a wayward, ungrateful child who refused to see reason. It was a beautiful, tragic story, and they played their parts flawlessly. I let them tell their comfortable lies to the town because it kept them entirely focused in the wrong direction, away from the quiet life I was building. Meanwhile, back in Bellmere, Corinne began to physically decline. It was not a sudden, dramatic cinematic collapse, but a slow, deeply frustrating loss of physical stamina. Her lungs grew weak, her breathing became labored during the humid summer months, and her daily mobility slowly dwindled to the confines of her third-floor apartment. Despite the hundreds of physical miles between us, I managed the entire back end of her life from my kitchen table. Over the course of 12 months, I consistently wired thousands of dollars from my own private savings directly into her personal checking account to ensure she never once missed her quarterly property tax deadlines. I paid the exorbitant commercial liability premiums for the Archer building, and I completely funded the emergency plumbing repairs when the second-floor pipe system inevitably failed during a brutal January freeze. Every single time I suggested taking a 2-week leave of absence from the bureau to drive back and stay in her spare bedroom to help her directly, she forcefully rejected the idea. She insisted I stay exactly where I was, maintaining my distance. Her refusals never felt like a rejection of my company or my care. Instead, her raspy voice over the phone always carried the tight, calculating tone of someone carefully arranging vital pieces on a chessboard. She was waiting for a very specific, inevitable moment, and she needed me safely out of sight, entirely off my parents' radar, until the trap was completely and perfectly set. Then, the waiting abruptly ended. A minor respiratory infection rapidly escalated into a severe, cascading medical complication, and Corinne passed away on a quiet Thursday morning. The shock of her death was a heavy, breathless blow to my chest. It felt as though the only anchor connecting me to my own history had suddenly snapped. But the formidable legal machinery she had meticulously put in place activated almost instantly, leaving absolutely no room for immediate emotional collapse. The very following afternoon, her longtime estate attorney contacted me to formally read the recently updated will. Corinne had left absolutely nothing to chance or interpretation. I was legally named the sole, uncontested executor of her entire estate. Furthermore, I was granted full, absolute legal ownership of the Archer building, all of its active commercial leases, and the substantial, highly coveted capital maintenance fund she had guarded so fiercely for 4 decades. It took exactly 48 hours for my parents to completely drop their carefully cultivated public masks. The tragic, infinitely patient parents mourning their estranged daughter vanished in an instant. They were immediately replaced by two people consumed by a sudden, violent, and entirely unmasked rage. After years of absolute silence on their end, my phone began to vibrate constantly with an endless stream of incoming calls and aggressive digital messages. My mother sent a lengthy text demanding that I immediately return her calls to have a mature, realistic discussion about the estate, heavily implying that I lacked the intelligence to manage it. My father sent an incredibly formal email insisting that a terrible, obvious administrative mistake had been made by a confused old woman, and that the property rightfully belonged to the immediate, local family who had supposedly cared for her. They spoke to me not as a grown, 34-year-old woman or the legal executor of an estate, but as a disobedient teenager holding something very shiny and very expensive that absolutely did not belong to her. They firmly believed that if they yelled loudly enough, applied enough immediate social pressure, and utilized their standard tactics of profound condescension, I would simply panic, fold under the weight of their disapproval, and hand over the keys to the kingdom. They fundamentally misunderstood who I had become and what I did for a living. I muted my phone, ignoring their endless, frantic notifications. I walked into my quiet bedroom and retrieved the heavy steel lockbox from the dark space at the back of my closet. I entered the combination, opened the heavy lid, and pulled out the thick, securely sealed manila envelope Corinne had mailed to me so many months prior. I sat on the edge of my bed and carefully broke the heavy security tape across the back flap. I had half expected to find a deeply emotional, handwritten letter, perhaps a sentimental goodbye or a final, tearful declaration of her familial love. I found neither. Corinne had absolutely no intention of wasting her final strength on flowery poetry or dramatic farewells. She had reached from beyond the grave to hand me a loaded weapon. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored cardstock containing a short, highly specific, bulleted list. It was a pure, unfiltered forensic directive. It instructed me to pull the summer maintenance logs and cross-reference them with the bank withdrawals. It told me to personally verify the authorization signatures on the August commercial insurance claims. It warned me to deeply investigate the origin and the licensing of the roofing contractor my father had supposedly recommended to her. The document in my hands was not a letter of mourning. It was my very first professional assignment as the true owner of the Archer building. A cold, clear command demanding that I check every single shadow, every single receipt, and every single bank transfer before I ever dared to trust a single word spoken by my own family. I returned to Bellmere under the cover of a bruised indigo twilight, carrying a single canvas overnight bag and the heavy weight of a looming war. I did not book a room at the local inn, nor did I even drive past the manicured subdivision where my parents lived. Instead, I parked my car in the narrow alleyway behind the square and quietly let myself into the third-floor apartment of the Archer building. The air inside was completely still, smelling faintly of dried lavender, old paper, and the sharp, unmistakable absence of the woman who had lived there for 4 decades. I dropped my bag onto the worn rug, walked straight to the heavy oak dining table, and turned it into a war room. My parents, acting with breathtaking speed, had already submitted a massive, seemingly comprehensive financial claim to the probate court. It was a thick, aggressively bound stack of documents detailing the supposed out-of-pocket expenses they had selflessly incurred to maintain Corinne's health and her property during her final declining year. They were officially demanding immediate and full reimbursement from the estate's liquid assets before any transfer of property could even be discussed. To the untrained eye of a busy county clerk, the itemized list looked like the tragic, burdensome ledger of a devoted family. But the moment I laid those claims next to Corinne's actual, hidden financial history, the polished facade immediately began to crack and splinter. The discrepancies did not announce themselves loudly. They whispered from the margins, exactly the way financial fraud always does. The first major anomaly I isolated was a staggering invoice for emergency roof repairs. My father had submitted a professionally printed bill from a local contractor, dated late September of the previous year, claiming he had personally fronted a massive sum of cash to fix a severe sudden leak over the bookstore. Yet, when I pulled the comprehensive digital records of the building's commercial property insurance, which I had personally maintained from 3 states away, there was absolutely no corresponding claim filed. No adjuster had ever visited the premises. Furthermore, a quick search of the county meteorological data confirmed that Bellmere had experienced a severe, highly publicized drought that entire autumn. There had been no rain for nearly 6 straight weeks, leading up to the date on the invoice. My father had requested reimbursement for fixing a phantom leak caused by phantom rain. Then, I turned my attention to the ground floor retail income. My parents' sworn accounting explicitly listed the monthly rent from the independent bookstore as entirely uncollected for 2 consecutive months during the early spring. The implication was clear and deeply insulting, suggesting they were trying to establish a paper trail proving Corone's mental state was deteriorating so rapidly that she was simply forgetting to collect her own primary source of income. It was a calculated narrative designed to prove her incompetence, but they did not know about the small, locked green metal cash box Corinne kept buried under a stack of winter sweaters in her bedroom closet. When I finally found the key and snapped the lid open, I did not find loose bills. I found 2 perfectly preserved carbon-copied receipts. They were written in Corinne's steady, angular handwriting, formally acknowledging the receipt of full, on-time cash payments from the bookstore owner for those exact 2 spring months. The most sickening discovery, however, was buried in the medical expense column. My mother had requested a massive reimbursement for what she categorized as specialized in home care services. According to her meticulously typed ledger, she had personally hired a private, unlicensed caregiver to tend to Corinne for 14 consecutive weeks. The schedule claimed this caregiver was present in the 3rd-floor apartment every single Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, specifically between the hours of 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock. It was a very expensive, very noble-sounding line item. I sat back in the wooden dining chair and pulled up the digital portal for the regional physical therapy clinic, a login Corinne had entrusted to me months ago. I downloaded her complete attendance log. The contradiction was absolute and undeniable. For 11 out of those 14 weeks, Corinne was actively signed into the clinic on the opposite side of town, grinding through intensive cardiovascular rehabilitation sessions during those exact same afternoon hours. My mother was demanding thousands of dollars for a ghost nurse tending to an empty apartment. I felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream, but I did not let it dictate my actions. I did not pick up my phone to scream accusations at them. I did not rush to the local police station with a handful of mismatched papers. I leaned into the absolute silence of the apartment and did the one thing I was vastly more qualified to do than anyone else in that town. I built a trap made entirely of data. I opened a blank, infinitely expanding digital spreadsheet on my laptop. I began to construct a rigid, unforgiving matrix of columns and rows. I meticulously logged every single dollar claimed, every specific date mentioned, and every individual named in their court filings. Then, in the adjacent columns, I anchored their claims against the indisputable, hard evidence I had quietly gathered. I created a timeline so dense, so heavily fortified by cross-referenced facts, that any fabricated data point instantly stood out like a rotting tooth. I was not jumping to emotional conclusions. I was methodically stripping away all the noise, all the familial drama, and all the performative grief, isolating their lies so perfectly that when they were finally exposed, those lies would have to stand entirely alone, completely unsupported by any shadow of a doubt. The sheer weight of my quiet, relentless digging must have generated a noticeable tremor in the local legal ecosystem. Perhaps the county clerk casually mentioned my extensive requests for archived property records. Or perhaps the physical therapy clinic called my parents to verify my authorization to access the logs. Whatever the trigger, the opposition suddenly realized I was not playing the role of the overwhelmed, grieving niece. This realization materialized 2 days before the preliminary evidentiary hearing. I was walking across the cracked, uneven asphalt of the courthouse parking lot, having just filed a formal motion demanding a fully extended, independent financial discovery phase. The late afternoon air was crisp and biting. As I approached my vehicle, Trent Bell stepped out from behind the gleaming silver door of his expensive, imported luxury sedan. He was waiting for me. He did not wear his usual aggressive courtroom scowl. Instead, he attempted to project an aura of friendly, informal ease, loosening his silk tie a fraction of an inch and offering a practiced, sympathetic smile that did not quite reach his cold eyes. He casually leaned against his car and offered me a sudden, highly polished settlement deal. His proposal was incredibly straightforward. He wanted me to sign a binding legal document voluntarily relinquishing all my rights, titles, and claims to the Archer property and its associated accounts. In exchange, he promised to facilitate a highly generous, completely tax-free lump sum payment, wired directly and quietly into my personal bank account by the end of the current business week. He framed it as a profound favor to me. He called it a dignified, mutually beneficial exit strategy, a painless way for me to secure a massive financial windfall without the agonizing stress of dragging our family's private, painful grief through a muddy, highly public, and incredibly humiliating local trial. He stood there, jingling his car keys in his tailored pocket, fully expecting me to seize the lifeline. He fundamentally believed I was terrified of public confrontation. He thought the sudden, flashing promise of quick, untraceable cash would instantly overpower the struggling, desperate daughter persona my parents had so thoroughly convinced him was real. But as I stood there on the cold asphalt, looking at the calculated desperation hiding just beneath his expensive cologne and confident posture, I felt absolutely no fear. The settlement offer did not intimidate me. It completely galvanized me. It was the final, undeniable proof I needed. Confident plaintiffs with an airtight, morally righteous case do not ambush the defense in a parking lot to offer a massive, preemptive payout. This was not a gesture of legal strength. It was an act of frantic, bleeding damage control. They were no longer trying to protect their pristine social standing, nor were they simply fighting to secure a property they felt they deserved. They were desperately trying to buy a heavy, permanent blanket to throw over the entire estate. The offer made me absolutely certain that my parents did not just want to win a civil lawsuit, they were terrified. They desperately needed to cover something massive up, and they needed the Archer building legally sealed and quietly liquidated before someone with my specific set of skills looked any closer at the decaying, fraudulent foundation they had built underneath it. I politely declined his offer, got into my car, and drove back to the apartment to add a new column to my spreadsheet. I stepped out of the narrow stairwell and walked directly into the ground floor bookstore. The tiny brass bell above the door chimed a bright, cheerful note that felt entirely out of place given the heavy nature of my visit. The air inside smelled deeply of vanilla, decaying paper, and binding glue. Nora Baines, a woman with striking silver hair and severely framed reading glasses, was standing behind the heavy mahogany counter. She did not offer me the usual Hollowtown condolences or pitying looks. Instead, she reached underneath the register and pulled out a thick, meticulously bound stack of carbon copy receipts. She placed them completely flat on the glass counter between us. She looked me straight in the eye and told me she had heard the vicious, terrible rumors my parents were actively spreading through the neighborhood. They had officially claimed to the court that Nora had missed 2 entire months of rent during the early spring. Nora forcefully pushed the fragile papers toward me, tapping a slender finger against her own looping signature and Corinne's sharp initials right next to it. She stated with absolute unyielding certainty that she had never missed a single payment in 20 long years of doing business in the Archer building. I left the quiet sanctuary of the bookstore and walked next door to the barber shop. Leon Mercer was slowly sweeping a pile of gray hair across the black and white checkered floor. When he saw me step through his door, he immediately stopped working and leaned his substantial weight heavily against his wooden broom handle. He did not waste my time with pleasantries or small talk. He vividly remembered a specific Tuesday afternoon when my mother, Mary Ann, had confidently marched into his busy shop. He told me she had loudly and aggressively demanded his monthly rent payment right then and there, insisting it must be paid entirely in untraceable cash. She had confidently told him that Karine's accounting system was a total, chaotic mess and needed immediate reorganization by someone capable. Leon knew in his bones that was a blatant, manufactured lie. Corinne was the most rigorously organized woman he had ever met in his life. She had never once asked for cash in 4 decades. He told me he had refused my mother, which had sent her storming out onto the sidewalk in a bitter rage. At the far end of the ground-floor hallway was the small, windowless notary office. The older gentleman who ran the operation had been officially stamping and sealing legal documents for my aunt for over a decade. He ushered me into his cramped workspace and quickly shut the heavy door behind us. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes were determined to speak the truth. He confessed in a low whisper that during the oppressive heat of the late summer months, my father, Douglas, had come down to the office several times. My father had aggressively pushed Corinne to sign her name to completely blank legal forms. The notary recounted how my father had used a sickeningly sweet, patronizing voice, telling Corinne it was simply a smart precaution in case she got too tired later in the week to handle administrative tasks. The notary had forcefully intervened, flatly refusing to place his official state seal on empty pages. That absolute refusal had made my father incredibly angry, leading to a loud, shouting argument that echoed down the quiet hallway. The fragile, meticulously constructed story my parents had presented to the judge was actively cracking and splintering faster than I could document it on my laptop. I left the Archer building and walked 1 block over to a quiet residential street to speak with a neighbor whose backyard directly faced the rear entrance of Corinne's home. The neighbor, an elderly woman who missed nothing, invited me into her neat living room and immediately pulled up the archived footage from her doorbell security system on her digital tablet. The glowing timestamp on the grainy, black-and-white video read exactly 11:45 at night on a humid Tuesday in late August. The screen clearly and undeniably showed my father sneaking quickly out of Corinne's back door. Tucked tightly and protectively under his right arm was a thick blue plastic file box. I knew that specific box incredibly well. It had always lived securely on the very bottom shelf of Corinne's private study, strictly holding her most sensitive personal notes and private financial ledgers. I rushed back up to the 3rd-floor apartment and sat down heavily at my dining table. I needed to trace the origin of the massive, fraudulent roof repair invoice my father had confidently submitted to the probate court. I accessed the state business registry online and pulled the official formation documents for the limited liability company prominently listed on the printed billhead. It took me less than 40 minutes of intense, focused cross-referencing to unravel the entire fraudulent thread. The roofing company was not a professional, licensed contractor firm at all. It was a tiny, invisible shell entity registered to a generic commercial mail drop located behind a rundown strip mall 2 towns over. When I finally found the registered owner's name buried in the secondary tax documents, my blood ran completely cold in my veins. The owner of the company was a man who went fly fishing with my father every single summer. It was a fake, manufactured company designed entirely to print legitimate-looking invoices and silently siphon thousands of dollars of estate money directly into their pockets. I desperately needed to find out what had actually happened to that blue box from the video. While sorting through Corinne's heavy winter coats in the dark hallway closet later that evening, my fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out a small, heavy brass key hidden deep inside a left pocket. I instantly recognized the manufacturer brand deeply engraved on the metal head. It belonged to the row of secure, reinforced storage lockers down in the damp basement of the Archer building. I walked quickly down the echoing concrete steps into the cellar and located locker number 4. The key turned smoothly and silently in the heavy lock. Inside, sitting entirely alone on the rusted metal shelf, was the exact same blue plastic file box my father had been carrying in the security video. Corinne must have somehow realized he had stolen it, forced him to return it under threat, and then immediately locked it away in the one place he would never think to look. I carried the box upstairs, my heart hammering fiercely against my ribs, and opened it under the bright light of the kitchen pendant lamp. Inside, resting carefully on top of a thick stack of old bank statements, was her daily spiral notebook. The lined pages were filled with short, sharp, clearly dated observations written in her familiar handwriting. One entry from early July simply read that they actually think I do not notice the rent money actively going missing. Another entry from late August stated that Marianne confidently told the neighbors, Paisley will never come back to this town to check on anything. The final entry, written just 3 short weeks before her unexpected death, was a stark, terrifying realization. It read that she desperately needed to change the terms of the will before they pushed her any harder into a corner. The absolute most devastating piece of evidence, however, was not written on a piece of paper. Tucked securely into the very bottom corner of the blue plastic box was Corinne's old, discarded cellular phone. I plugged it into a wall charger, holding my breath, and waited for the cracked screen to finally light up. I scrolled through the applications and found the voice memos folder. There was a single audio file recorded just 4 days before she went into the hospital for the final time. I pressed play. Her voice immediately filled the quiet, empty apartment. It was incredibly raspy, undeniably tired, but terrifyingly lucid and sharp. She stated clearly for the permanent digital record that if there was ever a legal dispute over her state of mind or the execution of her estate, whoever was listening needed to ask the court exactly where the Archer Capital Reserve Fund went last summer. The recording ended with a soft click, leaving a heavy, suffocating, absolute silence in its wake. I sat perfectly still in the darkening room, staring at the phone. The entire nature of my presence in Bellmere had fundamentally and permanently shifted in that exact moment. I was no longer just a distant, grieving relative fighting a defensive battle to secure an inherited piece of commercial real estate. I had crossed an invisible, highly dangerous boundary. I was now actively gathering the final, damning pieces of a massive, ugly puzzle my parents firmly thought they had permanently destroyed. They had systematically and cruelly preyed upon a dying woman, exploiting her declining physical health, completely confident that no one in the world would ever have the meticulous patience, the skill, or the sheer stubborn willpower to stitch their scattered, arrogant lies back together. They were about to find out exactly how incredibly wrong they were. During the agonizing, suffocating weeks leading up to the final evidentiary deadline, Trent Bell launched a relentless campaign designed entirely to shrink the massive scope of our legal battle down to a cheap, highly emotional melodrama. He flooded the county docket with a barrage of preliminary motions and sworn affidavits, all meticulously crafted to paint a specific, damning picture of me. He completely ignored the complex financial realities of the estate. Instead, he aggressively framed the entire dispute as a tragic, cautionary tale about a cold, estranged niece who had magically reappeared to manipulate a frail, declining old woman. He submitted lengthy documents emphasizing my prolonged physical absence from the town of Bellmere. He repeatedly pointed out, using aggressive, demanding language in his filings, that I had not attended a single family Thanksgiving or Christmas gathering in nearly a decade. He hammered home the point that I was never the one physically present to brew Corinne a warm cup of evening tea. Nor was I the one driving her to the local pharmacy to pick up her daily medication. According to his highly polished, theatrical narrative, my lack of daily, physical proximity meant I was morally bankrupt and fundamentally undeserving of any trust, let alone a substantial commercial inheritance. He wanted the judge to look at my physical absence and see cruel abandonment, deliberately ignoring the fact that it was actually a necessary act of self-preservation. My parents were absolutely, dangerously confident. They genuinely believed they had already secured their total victory long before we ever stepped foot inside the courthouse building. They operated under the arrogant, deeply flawed assumption that my years of strict, self-imposed silence meant I was weak, terrified, and entirely defenseless. They thought my refusal to engage in their screaming matches meant I was simply hiding in the shadows, waiting to be crushed. I chose a completely different path to prepare for the looming trial. I did not hire a flashy, expensive litigator in a custom-tailored suit to match Trent Bell's theatrical courtroom aggression. Instead, I sought the quiet, Strategic Counsel of Helen Vance. Helen was a retired probate attorney in her late 70s, a fiercely intelligent woman who wore thick woolen cardigans and had been Corinne's absolute closest confidant for over 30 years. Helen did not officially represent me on the legal record, but she sat with me at the heavy oak dining table in the third-floor apartment, drinking black coffee and guiding me through the treacherous, incredibly specific labyrinth of local judicial procedures. She taught me exactly how to properly format a legal exhibit and how to submit evidence so tightly bound by rigid procedural rules that no opposing lawyer could ever successfully motion to strike it from the official court record. Armed with Helen's invaluable procedural knowledge and my own rigorous professional expertise, I prepared my defense. I did not build a standard legal file. I engineered a highly pressurized explosive device. The sheer, cold precision with which I organized the documents was deliberately designed to make anyone who looked at it feel deeply uncomfortable. I divided the massive, towering stack of gathered evidence into 3 distinct, heavily fortified layers. The very first layer was designed to completely obliterate their false narrative of my supposed estrangement. It contained absolutely zero emotional pleas or sentimental letters. Instead, it was a solid, impenetrable wall of verified data. I included over 7 years of printed telephone company logs, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Corinne and I spoke every other week without fail. I included crisp copies of the complex digital spreadsheets I had built to remotely manage her property taxes, along with the corresponding official wire transfer receipts showing my own personal funds moving directly into her accounts to cover emergency building repairs during the exact times when my parents were supposedly managing her life. The second layer was the unvarnished, indisputable truth of the commercial cash flow. This section meticulously mapped out the exact, healthy financial status of the Archer building prior to my parents' sudden, intense involvement in her life, establishing a clear baseline of Corinne's financial competence. The third layer was the executioner. It was the surgical, line-by-line dismantling of every single fraudulent expense my parents had aggressively claimed in their bloated demand for estate reimbursement. The absolute final, devastating addition to this third layer arrived just 48 hours before the trial commenced. While I had previously viewed Corinne physical therapy attendance through an online patient portal to confirm my suspicions, digital screenshots are notoriously easy for a slick lawyer to dismiss as unverified or easily altered in a court of law. I desperately needed the ironclad, legally binding proof. After filing a formal subpoena at Helen's urging, the official hard copy attendance records arrived via certified mail directly from the clinic administrator. These dense pages bore the official raised ink seal of the medical facility. They legally and undeniably proved that on at least 11 completely separate occasions, the highly expensive, specialized in home care, my parents swore under oath they had personally paid for occurred exactly while Corinne was miles away from her apartment, actively sweating through supervised cardiovascular exercises on a stationary bicycle. It was the final nail, driven deeply and securely into the wood. The psychological warfare from my family did not stop with the official legal filings. On the very last evening before the trial, my mobile phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter. It was a direct, private message from my mother, Marianne. The artificial, polite facade she maintained for the lawyers and the public was completely gone. Her message was dripping with pure, concentrated venom and a breathtaking level of unearned condescension. She wrote that if I had even a single microscopic ounce of self-respect left in my miserable body, I would formally withdraw my claims and leave town before the sun came up. She viciously warned me to retreat before the entire population of Bellmere discovered that I was greedy enough to drag a dead relative out of the grave just to use her as a convenient shield for my own massive life failures. I did not type a furious, emotional response. I did not throw my phone across the room in a fit of manufactured, dramatic rage. I calmly connected my device to the small wireless printer I had set up on the desk. I printed her message on a crisp, heavy sheet of bright white paper. I carefully punched 3 holes down the left side and deliberately placed it into the final section of my binder. Filing it meticulously under the category dedicated to motive and psychological pressure. I did not include it to solicit sympathy from the judge, nor did I include it to complain about my cruel upbringing. I included it as cold, hard evidence to demonstrate exactly who in this family was actively attempting to shape the upcoming narrative through brute humiliation, intimidation, and character assassination. That night, the small town outside my window went completely, eerily quiet. I sat entirely alone in the dark kitchen of the third-floor apartment. The only illumination came from the vintage street lamps surrounding the historic square below, casting long, distorted yellow shadows across the cold glass window panes and onto the worn wooden floorboards. I traced the deep, familiar grain of the heavy dining table with my fingertips, feeling the heavy history embedded in the wood. For my entire life, my parents had tightly controlled the story. They had possessed the absolute power to dictate my reality, to bend the truth to fit their comfortable, pristine public image, and to punish me with their relentless, suffocating disappointment whenever I failed to reflect their glory. But tomorrow would be fundamentally different. Tomorrow, I would walk into that heavy wood-paneled courtroom. I knew they would attempt to tell the exact same old story. I knew they would try to bend reality one last time with their well-rehearsed tears, their expensive suits, and their perfectly practiced outrage. But as I sat there in the quiet dark, I felt a profound, terrifying sense of absolute peace wash over my shoulders. I realized that tomorrow morning, I would no longer be forced to simply sit back in silence and absorb their heavily distorted version of the past. Tomorrow, I was going to force their comfortable, arrogant lies to brutally and publicly collide with undeniable black ink and white paper. Trent Bell stood up from the heavy mahogany table, buttoning his custom-tailored suit jacket with a practiced, fluid motion that drew the eyes of everyone in the gallery. He approached the solid wooden podium in the center of the room with the easy, measured stride of a man who was entirely comfortable on this specific stage. When he finally spoke, his voice was rich, perfectly modulated, and expertly designed to carry all the way to the very last row of the packed courtroom without ever sounding like he was raising his volume. He opened his presentation by immediately painting a vivid, highly unflattering portrait of my character. He described me not as a grieving relative mourning a profound loss, but as a cold, calculating opportunist who had spent the better part of a decade comfortably ignoring her family from hundreds of miles away. According to his smooth, incredibly persuasive narrative, I was a total stranger who had magically and conveniently materialized back in my hometown the exact second the heavy keys to a highly valuable commercial property were ready to change hands. He paced slowly back and forth in front of the elevated bench, gesturing with open, seemingly honest palms as if he were simply a reasonable man trying to make logical sense of a deeply tragic situation. He insisted that the court must look closely at the undeniable physical reality of proximity. He stated loudly that true familial care requires physical presence, holding hands in hospital rooms, and making daily, exhausting personal sacrifices, absolutely none of which I had provided. When Trent finished painting his masterpiece of character assassination, he gracefully yielded the floor to my father. Douglas Hughes stood up slowly, his posture deliberately slightly stooped, delivering a masterful, heavily rehearsed performance of a man bowed completely by the twin burdens of crushing grief and sudden familial betrayal. He adjusted his dark tie and looked up at Judge Kessler, with eyes he had somehow managed to make look damp and profoundly weary. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, recounting the supposed endless hours he and his wife had spent managing the brutal, daily realities of an aging, confused woman. He confidently claimed they were the only ones actively navigating the complicated healthcare system, maintaining the sprawling brick building, and providing the crucial emotional anchor Corinne so desperately needed during her decline. He paused for dramatic effect, letting a heavy, ragged sigh escape his lips, before turning his gaze slightly toward my table. He told the court that while they were doing the hard, exhausting labor of being a real family, I was absolutely nothing more than a distant digital ghost. He claimed my only contribution to Corinne's final years was sending the occasional, sterile email, or making a brief, obligatory phone call on major national holidays. Then, the meticulously choreographed rhythm of the plaintiff table abruptly shifted. My mother, Marianne, stood up. She did not wait for her expensive lawyer to formally introduce her next point. She placed her pale hands completely flat on the wooden table and asked Judge Kessler for direct permission to address the court. The judge gave a single, curt nod, her expression unreadable. At first, my mother's voice trembled noticeably. It was a slight, delicate waver that sounded exactly like the overwhelming, uncontrollable sorrow of a heartbroken sister. But as she continued to speak, the highly practiced veneer of polite grief rapidly began to slip, peeling away in jagged strips to reveal the dense, hardened layers of absolute bitterness underneath. She gripped the heavy edge of the table tighter, her knuckles turning completely bone-white, and turned her head to look directly at me. The low, ambient murmuring in the packed gallery seemed to instantly evaporate into thin air. She locked her eyes onto mine, entirely abandoning the polite, sanitized legal fiction Trent Bell had carefully constructed for them. Her voice hardened, completely losing its artificial tremor, and she finally delivered the exact, venomous sentiment she had quietly harbored for decades. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger in my direction and let the words ring out violently across the silent room. She has always been our useless daughter. She is exceptionally good at disappearing when things get difficult. She is incredibly good at making other people clean up her massive messes, but she is utterly, entirely useless when her family actually needs her. The silence that violently slammed into the courtroom following that sentence was absolute and suffocating. It was not the respectful, attentive silence of a captivated audience. It was the shocked, breathless quiet of ordinary people who had just witnessed a brutal, completely unscripted car crash. That specific string of words was far too visceral, far too inherently cruel, to have ever been drafted by a highly paid defense attorney. It carried the undeniable, ugly weight of a genuine, deep-seated hatred. Trent Bell flinched visibly, his jaw tightening as he quickly reached out to touch my mother's arm, silently urging her to sit down and stop talking. He knew immediately that she had strayed violently off the approved sympathetic script and plunged them into highly dangerous territory. Judge Kessler leaned forward over the high bench, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied my mother's flushed face, and then she slowly shifted her intense gaze over to me. She was watching me closely, waiting for the inevitable, messy human reaction. She was fully expecting me to break down into angry tears, to shout an indignant denial across the aisle, or to launch into a passionate, defensive speech about my own character. I provided absolutely none of those things. The sharp sting of being called a useless daughter in front of 100 staring people was not new to me. It was simply a loud public broadcast of the quiet, private reality I had survived for 18 years. I did not blink. I did not let a single muscle in my jaw tighten. I simply looked away from my panting mother, turned my attention down to the pristine, meticulously organized binder resting squarely in front of me, and calmly opened the heavy front cover. I lifted the very first stack of documents from the binder. I did not stand up to give a dramatic speech. I did not address my mother or the packed gallery behind me. I simply handed the thick, neatly bound packet to the court clerk standing nearby, requesting quietly that it be officially entered into the permanent record. The packet was exactly 94 pages long. The very first page was a comprehensive summary index I had personally designed to trace every single digital wire transfer I had initiated over the past 84 months. Behind the index were the actual, verified bank statements showing thousands of dollars moving smoothly from my personal accounts directly into Corinne's property tax escrow. Following the financial data were 22 printed pages of our bi-weekly telephone logs, highlighting exactly 104 hours of recorded conversation time over the last year alone. The final section contained the highly technical, annotated maintenance contracts for the Archer building, complete with my own handwritten notes detailing the specific insurance adjustments I had secured for her from 3 states away. It was a massive, impenetrable fortress of silent, undeniable labor. Trent Bell practically leaped out of his expensive chair the moment the clerk handed a duplicate copy of the packet to his table. He flipped frantically through the pages, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense columns of data. He immediately recognized the lethal nature of what I had just submitted. It was not a messy emotional argument he could easily twist to his advantage. It was rigid, mathematical fact. He immediately launched into a loud, aggressive objection, desperately trying to severely minimize the devastating impact of the documents. He waved the heavy packet in the air, his voice rising in volume and losing its smooth polish. He fiercely argued that the court should look at these specific documents with extreme, profound suspicion. He loudly claimed that the files were far too organized, far too perfectly arranged, and far too heavily beneficial to a single, specific narrative. He boldly suggested that normal, grieving family members do not keep completely flawless, color-coded spreadsheets of their daily interactions with their dying relatives. He desperately tried to convince the judge that the sheer, uncompromising tidiness of the packet was, in and of itself, a massive, flashing red flag of deep manipulation and premeditated deceit. It was a weak, frantic argument, and everybody in the room knew it. He was essentially standing in front of a judge arguing that being highly competent was a suspicious crime. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the polished mahogany table, and watched Judge Kessler. She did not immediately sustain or overrule his frantic objection. Instead, she slowly lowered the heavy stack of papers onto her desk. She picked up her reading glasses, slid them carefully onto her face, and spent 2 full, agonizingly quiet minutes thoroughly examining the first 3 pages of the wire transfer logs. When she finally looked up, the entire atmosphere in the room had fundamentally shifted. She did not look at me with the weary, impatient tolerance usually reserved for warring, highly emotional family members. She looked at me with a sudden, sharp, and profound professional respect. She saw the rigorous formatting, the precise cross-referencing, and the cold, hard logic holding the entire packet firmly together. She realized in that exact moment that I was not a fragile, emotional niece scrambling to defend a bruised ego. I was a person who knew exactly what kind of destructive war I had walked into. I knew exactly what kind of highly calibrated ammunition I was sliding across the table, and I understood entirely why every single decimal point and date stamp was standing perfectly in its designated place. I stood slowly from my chair, lifting the next heavily bound file from my table. The courtroom had settled into a thick, expectant silence. I did not need to raise my voice or perform for the gallery. I simply began to guide the court through the exact, undeniable sequence of my parents' fabricated claims. I placed my mother's sworn, notarized statement of out-of-pocket home care expenses directly alongside the certified physical therapy clinic attendance sheets. I walked the judge through the timeline, speaking clearly and methodically. I demonstrated how, on 14 completely separate occasions, the highly expensive private caregiver my mother swore she had personally paid for was allegedly working in an empty apartment. I pointed out the exact hours, proving that Corinne was actively sweating through cardiovascular rehabilitation across town, while my mother was supposedly watching over her bedridden form. The individual, seemingly harmless charges my parents had submitted were no longer isolated errors. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, they instantly crystallized into a deliberate, predatory pattern of fraud. Trent Bell practically jumped from his seat, attempting to severely disrupt my momentum by calling witnesses to the stand, hoping to prove that my distance meant I was ignorant of Corinne's daily reality. It was a massive, fatal miscalculation. I called Nora Baines to the wooden witness box. The silver-haired bookstore owner took the required oath with an incredibly firm, unwavering voice. She did not offer long, emotional stories. She simply confirmed her signature on the carbon copy receipts I provided, stating unequivocally that she had never missed a single month of rent in 20 years, directly contradicting the official sworn statement my parents had submitted just weeks prior. Immediately following Nora, the elderly ground floor notary took the stand. He looked nervous, his hands tightly gripping the wooden rail, but his testimony was a surgical strike to my father's credibility. In just a few short sentences, he described the sweltering afternoon my father had marched into his office, aggressively demanding that the notary place his official state seal on completely blank legal documents under the flimsy guise of saving a tired woman some future effort. Those two brief testimonies completely shattered the foundation of Trent Bell's primary argument. They proved beyond any doubt that while I might not have been physically sitting in the local diner every morning, I was deeply, intimately embedded in the actual, functional reality of Corinne's life and business. Sensing the rapidly collapsing walls of his case, Trent Bell made a desperate tactical pivot. He put my father, Douglas, on the stand to fiercely defend the single largest expense in their file, the massive emergency roof repair invoice. My father adjusted his expensive suit and leaned into the microphone, attempting to project the image of a weary but responsible patriarch who had simply stepped in to handle a messy construction disaster. But when I was granted the opportunity to question him about the specific details of that expensive repair, his confident facade instantly crumbled. I asked him for the exact name of the professional contracting firm he had supposedly vetted and hired. He hesitated, his eyes darting frantically toward his lawyer. He stammered out a name that did not match the printed invoice, accidentally naming his old fishing buddy's primary business instead of the fake shell company they had established. I pressed further, asking him to recall the exact month he had spent days managing these loud, intrusive repairs. He confidently stated the work was completed in late July. I simply held up the fraudulent invoice he had submitted, which was clearly and boldly dated late September. He had fundamentally forgotten the specific details of his own manufactured lie because he had never actually stood on that roof, and he had never paid a legitimate crew to fix it. He was a man drowning in his own perjury. The air in the courtroom grew incredibly heavy, thick with the undeniable realization of what was actually happening. I did not stop to let them breathe. I submitted the printed copy of the vicious, condescending text message my mother had sent me the previous night. I explained to Judge Kessler that I was not submitting it to complain about bad parenting, but to clearly demonstrate the immense psychological pressure and blatant intimidation tactics the plaintiffs were actively using to force a surrender before their financial ledgers could be examined. Immediately following the text message, I asked the court clerk to play the digital audio file extracted from Corinne's old cellular phone. Trent Bell slammed his hands onto his table, shouting a fierce, desperate objection. He argued vehemently that the recording was unverified, highly prejudicial hearsay that lacked proper context. Judge Kessler fixed him with a cold, unyielding stare. She flatly overruled his aggressive objection, stating clearly that she was allowing a limited consideration of the audio specifically because it did not stand alone as a random emotional statement, but was deeply and directly supported by the mountain of forensic financial evidence already entered into the permanent record. The clerk pressed a button, and Corinne's raspy, exhausted, yet fiercely determined voice echoed through the silent courtroom speakers. Her words were sharp and unmistakable. She warned whoever was listening to look closely at the Archer Capital Reserve Fund before believing any belated kind words from her family. That recording was the catalyst for the final devastating blow. I opened the last section of my binder and presented the comprehensive cash flow analysis of the Archer Capital Reserve Fund. This was the highly protected money Corinne had spent decades saving for catastrophic building emergencies. I presented official bank subpoenas showing a distinct, chilling timeline. Over the course of the previous summer, a series of structured, seemingly random withdrawals had been quietly pulled from Corinne's primary reserve account. Each withdrawal was carefully calculated to stay just beneath the threshold that would automatically trigger a federal banking alert. I did not just show the money leaving, I showed exactly where it went. I presented the tracing documents proving those specific funds flowed through a temporary intermediary account. Then, in the most damning revelation of the entire morning, I cross-referenced those exact withdrawal dates with public county financial records. The timeline was a perfect, inescapable match. Exactly 48 hours after every single unauthorized withdrawal from Corinne's life savings, My parents had miraculously made massive, lump sum payments to completely settle their own severely overdue commercial mortgage debts and outstanding tax liens. They had not been protecting her. They had been actively, systematically bleeding her dry to save their own collapsing lifestyle. I slowly looked across the aisle at the plaintiff table. For the very first time in my entire 34 years of existence, the expression on my mother's face was not one of wounded righteousness, profound disappointment, or arrogant superiority. Her perfect posture had completely collapsed. Her hands were shaking violently in her lap. As she stared at the damning flowcharts brightly displayed on the court's evidence monitors, the devastating reality finally crashed down upon her. She suddenly understood, with absolute clarity, that her opponent had not come to this courtroom seeking emotional validation, a tearful family apology, or a dramatic reconciliation. I had arrived entirely devoid of emotion, armed with a ruthless, unforgiving audit that cared absolutely nothing for her social standing or her polite suburban lies. Judge Kessler sat back in her high leather chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. The civil trial over a simple property dispute had fundamentally mutated right in front of her eyes. She looked down at the staggering pile of financial discrepancies, fraudulent invoices, and documented theft. She picked up her wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that made Trent Bell physically jump. She did not issue a final ruling on the inheritance right then and there. Instead, she announced an immediate, mandatory recess. Her voice was incredibly stern, stripped of any usual judicial patience. She firmly commanded both legal teams to remain in the building while she completely reviewed the new financial evidence in her private chambers. As she stood up to leave the bench, she looked directly at Trent Bell and delivered a cold, terrifying warning. She stated that this proceeding was no longer just a messy disagreement over a family will. She warned them that the evidence presented had clearly crossed a highly dangerous threshold, moving rapidly away from a standard probate conflict and directly into the severe, unforgiving territory of organized elder abuse and deliberate financial fraud. The mandatory recess felt as though it stretched across an entire lifetime. I sat completely motionless at the heavy defense table for exactly 47 minutes. The packed gallery behind me did not engage in their usual, excited, small-town gossip. The sheer, undeniable gravity of the financial evidence I had just laid bare had successfully suffocated the ambient noise in the room. Trent Bell sat perfectly still beside my parents, his expensive pen abandoned on his legal pad, actively refusing to make eye contact with the people who had just paid him thousands of dollars to defend a crumbling lie. When the heavy wooden door behind the bench finally swung open again, the bailiff did not even need to call the room to order. We all rose in absolute deafening silence. Judge Miriam Kessler took her seat. She did not look angry. She did not display the righteous, fiery indignation that lawyers often use for theatrical effect. Instead, she possessed a profound, chilling calmness that was infinitely more terrifying than any raised voice. It was the specific, settled calmness of a formidable legal mind that had thoroughly examined a manufactured narrative and found it completely, disgustingly hollow. She arranged her notes on the elevated desk, adjusted her glasses, and looked directly at the plaintiff table. She began her final ruling by systematically dismantling the foundation of my parents' entire legal argument. She stated for the permanent court record that Douglas and Marianne Hughes had failed spectacularly to provide even a single credible ounce of evidence suggesting that Corinne Vale was mentally incapacitated, confused, or suffering from undue manipulation during the final months of her life. The judge noted that the extensive documented financial history I had provided painted the exact opposite picture. The evidence clearly demonstrated a woman acting with total lucidity, rigorous preparation, and absolute, undeniable purpose. Judge Kessler stated that Corinne changed her final will and testament specifically because she possessed the sharp, tragic clarity to recognize the immense financial risk approaching her from the very people who shared her own bloodline. Then, Judge Kessler paused. She folded her hands over her legal pad and looked directly into my mother's pale, stricken face. The judge did not speak loudly, but her words carried the heavy, unyielding weight of a falling anvil. "The court has reviewed the extensive evidence presented today," Judge Kessler said, her voice echoing off the high paneled walls, "and the court absolutely does not see a useless daughter sitting at the defense table. What the court sees is the only single human being in this entire room who treated the deceased with genuine honesty, profound competence, and absolute moral responsibility." The impact of that single sentence was physically palpable. It completely inverted the cruel, suffocating label my parents had violently forced onto my shoulders for my entire life. This was no longer just a private, whispered family disagreement hidden behind the pristine, closed doors of a wealthy suburban home. It was a loud, undeniable, public moral judgment delivered from the highest authority in Bellmere. My mother physically flinched, shrinking down into her chair as if she had been violently struck. Judge Kessler did not linger on their humiliation. She moved swiftly and decisively through the legal mandates. She officially dismissed the plaintiff's petition to annul the final codicil of the will with extreme prejudice. She formally confirmed my legal status as the sole, uncontested executor of the estate and the absolute, rightful owner of the Archer Commercial Building, including the entirety of its heavily guarded capital maintenance fund. But the absolute, crushing finality of her ruling did not stop with the inheritance. She systematically rejected every single fraudulent claim for out-of-pocket care costs my parents had arrogantly submitted. She explicitly stated that their fabricated invoices and manufactured home care ledgers were an insult to the integrity of the judicial system. Furthermore, she announced that she was legally obligated to forward the entire binder of financial discrepancies, specifically the evidence regarding the abnormal summer cash withdrawals and the fraudulent Shell Company roofing invoice, directly to the State Financial Review Board and the County District Attorney for immediate, further criminal investigation. My parents did not win a single thing. They had walked into the courthouse expecting a swift, profitable surrender. They were walking out facing the total destruction of their social standing and the very real, terrifying prospect of a thorough criminal audit. The gavel fell one final, echoing time, officially closing the session. I carefully packed my laptop and my meticulously organized binders back into my canvas bag. I did not look at the gallery as I walked down the central aisle, but I could feel the intense, shifting weight of the town's perception. The whispering had completely stopped. When I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the wide, echoing marble hallway of the courthouse, I found my parents waiting for me near the large, arched windows. The aggressive, righteous confidence that had defined their entire existence was entirely gone. They looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly lost. My father, Douglas, took a hesitant step forward. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to find the words to address a woman he was only just now realizing he had never actually known. He looked at me not as a disobedient child, but as an incredibly dangerous adversary he had foolishly underestimated. He managed to stammer out the beginning of a sentence, a weak, fumbling attempt to explain away the unexplainable, but the words died in his throat. My mother stepped up beside him. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking. She looked at my face and attempted to force out an apology. She whispered that they were just under a lot of stress, that things had gotten out of hand, and that she was sorry for the harsh words she had used in the courtroom. But her apology possessed absolutely no weight. It did not sound like genuine, soul-searching remorse. It sounded exactly like the desperate, frantic sound of a heavy door creaking open only because the person inside suddenly realized the wind had violently shifted against them. They were only sorry because they had been caught, exposed, and stripped of their power. I stood there in the cold, naturally lit hallway, holding my canvas bag, and looked at the two people who had spent my entire childhood slowly eroding my spirit. I felt no urge to scream at them. I felt no desperate, lingering need to hurl insults or demand a deeper, more painful apology. The time for that kind of loud, messy vengeance had passed long ago. I kept my voice perfectly level and completely calm. I told them that I was going to keep the Archer building. I told them I was going to spend the next year carefully restoring the dusty, empty space on the third floor, transforming it into a bright, welcoming public reading and workspace specifically named in honor of Corinne Vale. I looked them straight in the eyes and delivered my final, unyielding condition. I told them that if they ever truly wanted to step foot inside my life again, they would have to completely abandon their comfortable lies. They would have to approach me as people who deeply, fundamentally respected the cold, hard truth. They could no longer walk through my door believing that if they just called me useless long enough and loud enough, the rest of the entire world would eventually believe it. I turned away from them, pushed open the heavy brass doors of the courthouse entrance, and walked out into the crisp, clearing afternoon air, leaving them completely alone with the devastating reality they had built for themselves. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.